The ravens came in from a low sky that never brightened. They beat black against the gray, wheeled once over the first blue-white line of snow-capped battlements, and dropped upon the crenels like scraps of night. Their feathers were rimed with frost. The air itself seemed to have teeth. Sansa felt the bite in her lungs and in the small of her back as she crossed the courtyard. Cloak held close, fur hood pressed down as if she might keep the wind from thinking her hair a thing to snatch away. Winterfell's gates were barred. Smoke from the chimneys sagged and fell back upon the rooftops. In the winter town beyond the walls, the poorest houses crouched under drifts that smoothed every sharp line. The godswood stood as it had always stood, red leaves whispering without breath in what should have been a stillness. But even there the hush was the silence of the woods holding their breath before a hunter's footfall. A handful of men hauled a cauldron of pitch toward the battlements, their boots scraping on the packed paths of trampled snow. Another group, cheeks flayed pink by the cold, hauled sacks of grain into the stores. Fires smoldered under iron kettles. Women fed them and coughed softly and said nothing. "Lady Sansa," Maester Wolkan said as she came up the steps to the great hall. "Another raven from the Queen's Crown Tower. Tormund Giantsbane sends word from Eastwatch. If the raven flew straight, it is 3 days old." 3 days, she murmured. "Give me the letter," crackled as she took it. In the great hall, a small fire tried to make the air less cruel. The long tables stood empty, set for no feast, their boards scoured and bare. On the dais, a map lay spread beneath river stones, a child's drawing compared to the winter that had drawn its own map across the world. Sansa leaned over it, papery light in her hands, and read Tormund's broad hand. The wall fell. "The storm moves with them. We ride south. The dead do not tire. Do we have word from Jon?" she asked. Wolkan shook his head. Only the last raven from White Harbor, that he had left Dragonstone aboard the royal fleet. Winds from the north delay them. Sansa folded the letter once, twice, until it was a small square. She held it between forefinger and thumb a long moment, feeling the press of paper and the bones in her own hand. She felt suddenly 17 again, a girl who imagined rescue with a song at its center. She was not that girl now. She turned. "Send for Lord Yone, and for Lady Lyanna, Ser Brienne as well. I want the heads of houses and their captains in council. And fetch my sister. Fetch Arya." Wolkan bowed and went. Sansa was alone long enough to hear a stone pop at the edge of the fire and fly into the ashes. She walked to the doors and looked out over the courtyard. Snow sifted down, so thin it might have been flour shaken from the sky. The ravens on the battlements clicked their beaks. One of them looked at her and cocked its head. "I need you to fly faster," she told it under her breath, and turned back when the doors opened and boots and cloaks and cold and breath steamed into the hall. Jon Royce came with snow powdered on his eyebrows, a mountain of a man in bronze scales and a heavy fur cloak clasped with an eagle. Lyanna Mormont walked beside him, small and sure-footed, her jaw set as if she were marching to an argument. Brienne of Tarth followed with Podrick Payne, blue eyes bright in a face gone paler from the cold, her red-gold hair braided close to her head. She moved like a tower would move if a tower could choose where to put its feet. Glover of Deepwood Mott came grumbling with a strip of cloth across his ear, frostbitten and healing. The older men of the north gathered behind them, their faces a weathered landscape of worry and resolve. And Arya, Sansa's sister, came in silent as the snow. A gray cloak hung unmarked upon her shoulders. Her dark hair was tied back. The dagger at her hip, Valyrian steel, caught a line of firelight and returned a thin, cold gleam. Needle was at her back, a shadow's shadow. Sansa told them what the letter said. She told them what it did not need to say. She did not let her voice break where it wanted to, did not look down to watch her fingers knot into her own skirts. She said, "We can expect no help from the south in time. We must hold until Jon returns, or we must move our people now." Jon Royce planted his thick hands at the table, leaning on his knuckles. "Move them where? We are winterlocked. The roads are worse than bad. The White Knife is ice and slush. You would drive a town across all that on a rumor." "It is not rumor," Brienne said quietly. I rode with the dead once in Renly's camp. I know the cold of it. This is not rumor, Lord Yon. This is a storm you can smell on iron. Lyanna's chin lifted. Bear Island has fewer than 1,000 fighters left to protect our own, and we have sent most of them to Winterfell already. We didn't come here to flee. We came here to fight. Glover harumphed into his beard. I say we hold walls. Fires on the first line, pitch on the second, boiling water, oil if we must, though the stores. They will freeze, Arya said. Every head turned to her. She stood with hands empty, but she looked like a knife that had decided to pretend to be a girl. In the bad winters, Arya went on, they say the rivers froze from the top down, but this kind of cold, this is a different thing. Comes from them. It makes fire sullen. Oil won't pour. The dead don't burn like living men. Burn them to ash or they climb. You put people in the crypts, she said to Sansa. He will raise them. Brienne's mouth tightened. The crypts are stone. The maester cleared his throat. The oldest kings were laid with iron swords across their knees. Iron to keep dark things from stirring. But the lore says iron keeps fairies and forest sprites at bay. Not that. He trailed off as if the word were a cold pebble too big for his mouth. He raised men at Hardhome, Arya said. And more than men. Bones walked. I heard it from the Night's Watch. I heard it from the Hound. The crypts are full of bones. Silence fed upon silence. Sansa thought of the long rows, the carved faces of kings and lords, their features softened by centuries of touch and dust, their stone direwolves at their feet. She thought of her father's empty niche and her mother's body. No, her mother had been carried downriver, but father's bones had never returned to Winterfell. They were somewhere on one road or another or in a trench or ash, but not here, not where she could kneel and touch the stone and pretend it remembered him. She turned to Wolken. Prepare the winter town to evacuate. The weak, the very young and old, send them to White Harbor at once. The roads are bad, but the river is worse. Use sledges where you must. Send Lord Manderly word that the north is coming down out of the hills to him. The rest. She looked at Royce's calm, at Lyanna's iron, at Brienne's steady regard. The rest we keep behind these walls. We hold Winterfell as long as we can. If Jon and the Queen reach White Harbor, Manderly will tell them what we have done. Royce nodded once. Harbor's a day and a half if the wind's with you, 2 if it's not. A march that's slow will cost you, but better a cost you can count than one you can't. I'll set my men to clearing the east road and dragging sledges. Lyanna was already turning for the door. I'll go to the yard. My men will patrol the winter town and bring them up. No one sleeps tonight. Brienne said, I will see to the Godswood. If he comes, he will go there. Sansa looked to her sister. Arya didn't nod, didn't give any sign of approval or disapproval either, but something in her shoulders eased, a fraction. She said, I'll see the crypts. If there are bones that want to walk, I'd rather meet them standing up. Wolken hesitated. There is one thing more. Lord Baelish requests an audience. He asks that it be private. Sansa did not let her eyes close. She had been many kinds of girl in many kinds of rooms. She would not be a girl in a room with Peter Baelish again. Have him brought to the Great Hall, she said. Now. They brought him wrapped in sable. Snow clung to the stubble on his cheeks like ash. He was thinner than he had been, or the light made him look so. He produced a smile that tried to be rueful, the smile of a man who had just returned to his own house to find the door barred and pretended to be delighted by the surprise. Lady Sansa, he began. Don't, she said, and the word was a shard of ice. You don't address me by any name that sounds like it once meant something to me. He opened his hands, palms empty, as if his life were nothing at all. There is a storm coming, Sansa. You need allies who can do what Jon Snow cannot. You need cunning to match cold. You know me. I know Winterfell. There are passages. I know them better than you, Arya said. Peter looked at her as if she were a mouse that had spoken. He blinked. No doubt you do. You are your father's daughter. And your mother's. Sansa. Brienne had not moved, but Oathkeeper was suddenly in her hand, as if the sword had been tired of being a strip of quiet steel and had asked to be what it was. "Enough," she said. "Peter," Sansa said, and the labor it took to shape the name did not matter now. "I know what you have done. I know what you wanted to do. I know what you are. You are not a weapon we can point at the dead. You are not a man we can trust at the gate. It would be better to put a hungry she-bear on the wall and promise to feed her with our own hands." He tried another smile. It died as soon as it was born. He glanced at the map, at the faces, at the doors. His eyes came back to Sansa. For the first time she saw fear in them. Not the feigned kind. Not the kind he used as coin, but real fear. The fear of a man who has just discovered the room he always thought he could leave has no door behind him. "Whatever you think you know," he began hoarsely. Bran's voice came thinly from the doorway to the side. He had come in with his sled, hodders old, turned and refitted for the winter. 2 men had drawn him. His face was pale and his lips blue at the edges. He spoke as if from a long way off. "He betrayed father in King's Landing. He put the knife to his throat. He sold our sister to the Boltons. He made Jon Arryn die. He told our mother a lie and set a war to burning. He pushed our aunt through the moon door while the singers were playing in the hall." Peter turned, as if he could step by that thin voice, as if he could outrun it. "This is some trick," he said, but it came out as a whisper. Arya drew the dagger and in the same breath put it back. It was as if the sound of steel leaving leather had been reminder enough. Sansa felt the hall watching her. She did not look to any side for permission, not to Brienne, not to Bran, not even to the old gods that watched in their own way through 1,000 pieces of 1,000 trees. "Sir Brienne," she said, and the words surprised her in how steady they were. "As Lady of Winterfell, I hold Peter Baelish guilty of treason against my house and crimes against my blood. Execute the sentence due him." There was a kind of mercy in how quickly it went. Oathkeeper flashed, and Peter's voice broke into a plea that had been so carefully crafted it tasted of dust. His blood steamed on the flagstones. Sansa didn't move until the steam thinned, and then she motioned for the body to be wrapped in the sables he had worn in. They lifted him and took him out. Brienne cleaned her blade. Winter creaked in the beams overhead and the ravens outside threw rough shadows on the snow. When it was done, the hall breathed again. In her chest, Sansa discovered that she could, too. "We have other work," she said. "Lord Yone, see to the road. Lady Lyanna, the town. Podrick, help Maester Wolkan with his lists. Brienne, Godswood." Arya, her sister, had already gone. The day bent into evening without anything you could call sunset, and then there was night. They lit the torches atop the battlements. The iron braziers glowed, their heat an insult to the cold that flowed through the joints of the walls as if stone were cloth and cloth were nothing. Men walked from post to post in pairs, their heads hooded, breath trailing like banners. Just before dawn the sound came. First it was nothing. At first it was the sound of a mind trying to make the entire world a thing you could listen to, and of course it failing. Then it was a low murmur like something a man would hear if he had fallen asleep in a house where many people lived and had woken with a thought he could not name. Then it was the grind of winter itself, trees groaning in the deep forests, ice splitting, the footfall of something that had never learned to care for doors. The horns blew. Men woke and reached for spears and shields as if they had been waiting for hands all their lives to be hands. Sansa stood on the rampart with her cloak whipping, her hair making the same small sounds of complaint it had made when she was a child and winter plucked at it. Beside her stood Royce. On her other side was Wolkan clutching a roll of parchment in both hands as if he intended to strangle it if it wavered. At first there was nothing to see. The sky and the field below the wall were the same color and the same motion. Then the snow shifted. It became darker, not with the promise of warmth, but with the fact of bodies moving under it. The first figures came out of the blur at a steady pace. Men whose faces were a map of wounds that would never close and wounds that had never opened. Women with hair that trailed behind them like weeds in a river. Children with lips drawn back from their teeth. They came on in a line that held its shape because it did not know how to be anything else. They were not alone. Behind them and among them strode taller figures with eyes like chips of broken sky. They did not hurry. They did not lift their arms. The snow seemed to listen to them, and above them all came a sound like iron screaming. Sansa lifted her eyes. The dragon's cry cleaved the winter. He dove from the clouds with frost steaming from his wings, blue flame in his throat that cast no light. The first lance of fire shot toward the outer wall and struck it where the stones were thickest. For a heartbeat, the wall glowed orange, and then a white brightness swallowed color itself. Stone ran like wax, then cracked and fell away. The blaze was not heat alone. It was hunger. It sought edges and devoured them, sought wholeness and broke it. A section of battlement slid away, and there was a gap where there had been none. Viserion, Brienne said under her breath on the tower where she had gone to see. Sansa did not pray. The prayers she had learned were for harvests and weddings and men in soft leather boots that had never learned about sharpness. She said, "Archers, loose!" And the first volley of fire-tipped arrows went up and fell like sparks made of wood. Men on the walls heaved pots of pitch over the edge. It fell and splashed and burned with a sullen yellow rage that was more smoke than fire. The first rank of the dead did not slow. They trudged into the burning black pools and dragged their feet out again, leaving footprints of fire that guttered and were gone. The crossbows thunked. The bolts took dead men in the eye and the chest and the thigh. They fell and rose again unless their spines were cut like cords, and then they crawled. In the yard below, the gate groaned as men hauled on the winches. "Hold," Royce bellowed to the men at the bar. "Hold until my word." From the winter town came the sound of sleigh runners and hooves, of children crying and women calling names and the crack of whips on the backs of stubborn mules. Lyanna Mormont's voice carried like a braid of iron, ordering door after door to be opened and emptied. Brienne's mouth was a hard line. She had sent a ring of men to the Godswood, the best of the Stark guards and a handful of Vale men-at-arms in bronze scales whose breath fogged the air in steady clouds. Podrick had gone with them to watch Bran, to haul the boys' sledge if it came to running. Brienne could not be in both places. She watched. She made herself remember the weight in her hand of Oathkeeper, as if just now it had not been tasked with ending a life in the Great Hall, but had just been given to her again by a man who had looked at her like one looks at a truth one had once mocked and now cannot live without. "More oil," Glover rasped behind her, dragging a barrel toward the rampart. Men cut the top free with axes, half-frozen oil sloshing sluggishly, then heaved the barrel to the edge and tipped it. Arya had not come to the wall. She had gone into the belly of the castle. Sansa's cheeks burned with the cold until she had no cheeks. She was a seeing thing and a speaking thing and a thing made to decide when to do it. "Loose," she said again. "Hold. Loose." The words found their own rhythm. The dead found the wall. Ladders appeared where there had been none, rough-hewn and squeezed from the snow by hands that did not feel. The first dead men began to climb. Waiting men thrust spears down and broke skulls and pushed at shoulders. A white figure in the field below turned its face toward the wall, and a sheet of hoarfrost swept the stones, covering the pitch in a glaze that stopped it smoking. Men gasped. One man set his foot wrong on a rung slick with ice and fell. Then the dragon came again, his cry sweeping the battlements empty of sound. He raked a stripe of flame across the outer wall, and this time the stones in that place ceased to be stones. The gap widened. Dead men flowed toward it like water toward a spill in a weir. Sansa thought she saw, blue in the eyes, the bow of the head, but she was not certain, and certain would have been no help. "Back from the outer range," Royce shouted. "Back to the second walk. Regroup." The horn blew once, twice. Men shouted down to men below. The first line began to move back along the inner path of the wall. Snow ground under boots. Sansa turned. "Wolken," she said, "send the signal. Bring the children up from the crypts to the inner court. Now." He stared. "The crypts, my lady." "Do it," she said, and the words were a blade against her own ribs. The maester ran, parchment flapping, and Sansa watched the line of the dead find the gap and pour into the space in the outer wall where stones had been a breath before. It was not a flood. It was not water. It was the thing that came when a flood had already done its work and left behind a river with no name. In the corridors below, Arya moved as if the hallways had been built to fit her exactly. She counted steps by feel. 1, 2, 3, turn 5, 6, door. Her breath came even. Needle rode on her back, the dagger at her hip, the weight of them part of her weight. When she reached the gate to the crypts, 2 men stood there in stark gray with faces she knew as you know faces that belonged to days when you still had a father. Men who had carried her over the ice in the courtyard when she had fallen in. Men who had laughed once when she had been small and had put her on the back of a gray pony and told her not to tell her mother. Their names came and went. She stepped between them and went down. Stone steps, the smell of dust, old air. Her hands knew where the torches were. She took one, careful to keep her breath low so it would not gutter, careful to keep the flame tall. The first row of tombs lay before her. She lifted the torch and ran the light over the carved faces. Names, kings, lords, knees with iron swords. She listened. She heard nothing but her own breath. H at first, and then somewhere deeper the rustle of many bodies and a low moan. It had the sound of wind, but there was no wind this deep. She moved forward. Women sat with children in the alcoves and stared at her with eyes so wide their whites had become moons. A boy of 4 clutched a wooden stag, antlers broken. Arya caught one mother's wrist, a hard enough pressure to be felt through terror. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "I want you to take every child here and follow the men who are going to come down the stairs. You will go up and into the inner yard. Do you understand me? If anyone tells you to go deeper, you will not. You will come up. Now." The woman stared another heartbeat, then nodded. Arya moved on. Arya was not a woman you argued with when she spoke this way. At the far end of the first row, something scratched. It was small at first, the kind of sound you would miss if you were thinking of your aunt's face, the way she used to pat your shoulder as she passed and how she had smelled of something that might have been honey. Arya stopped and put the torch down and drew the dagger. A thin line of frost had formed along the edge of the stone effigy, as if it had been breathing. She did not let herself think of the name carved there. The iron sword across its knees was spotted with rust. "Up," she whispered, and turned and went. And behind her the scratch sounded again, as soft as an animal in a wall. In the yard above, Lyanna Mormont held a spear as tall as she was tall and walked the line of sledges. "You," she said to a boy of 10 with chapped cheeks pushing at the back of a sledge that was not moving. "Put your back into it, not your hands. Like this." She leaned with her whole small body and the runner's bit and the sledge slid an inch. The boy grunted and did as she had said. "Lady Lyanna," a man called. "The east gate's blocked. Drifts up to a horse's shoulder. So use the south sally," she snapped. "We're not waiting for the storm to asking it where it wants us to go." A roar shook the air and men looked up. The dragon cut across the sky like a wound. A second shape rose from behind the inner wall, huge and dark against the snow, slower than the first, a shadow made of muscle and ancient fury. The cry that answered was a sound no living thing should have been able to make. But Drogon was nothing the world had counted on. He came down with his wings beating great shapes in the air, snow exploding from rooftop and ridge. He struck the blue dragon at the edge of the storm and there was, for a heartbeat, a shape within shape, a knot of motion like 2 storms colliding. Regal climbed up into the wind in a steep spiral, his green and bronze an ache of color, his mouth a furnace. Sleet skinned his wings. He coughed fire down upon the dead and the fire hissed and died where it met the unnatural cold and then burned again where it found oil, wood, hair, cloth, the ladders, the raised hands that reached to pull men from the wall. On the western parapet, Sansa had to catch herself with both hands on the stone as the wind from the wings knocked her forward. Her hood flew back and the cold punched at her skull. She looked up. The Dragon Queen rode the black dragon, hair silver blue in the storm. For a long heartbeat the distance narrowed. Sansa saw a face set to a blade's edge. Then the dragons twisted aside and clashed again and the blue dragon screamed and, falling, caught itself and came low, boiling a swath of wall to ruin with a river of blue fire. Men died. Men made of the hard winter that had shaped the north were as nothing before that brightness. Sansa pressed numb fingers to the stone. The dead surged toward the second wall. Royce swore in the old way. "Back!" he roared again. Back to the court, to the inner yard. Glover's men hauled the great bar across the inner gate. The first of the dead reached it and threw themselves against it without breath, without shouts, without hate, only the push of a tide against a rock. A wight taller than a tall man stepped among them and drove a spear of pale ice through the gap. Frost crawled along the oak, across the iron straps, a white lace knitting itself by an invisible hand. A hammerman swung at the spear and his hammer struck and shattered. Shards of ice bit his face and he screamed once and clapped his hands to the blood. "Set the yard alight," Sansa said. "Everything that will burn. Now." They hurled pitch and straw and broken benches and a wagon and a trestle. They splashed them with oil and thrust torches into the mess, and it went up, sullen and then hungry, a brown fire that cried in the cold. They'd built bonfires in their minds for weeks. It was not enough, but it was enough in spots. Dead men in the yard caught and kept burning. A ladder somebody had dragged in by mistake went up in a hiss and then a whoosh. The air stank of tallow and hair and pitch, and still they came. Brienne left the wall without looking back, taking the steps 3 at a time in her steel feet. She had never moved so quickly in armor. The weight had always been a comfort to her, a thing to hold her to herself. Now it was a thing you argued with. She ran into the godswood like any other kind of woman, breath smoking, ears filled with the small sound of snow falling from boughs. The heart tree stood like an accusation, bleeding sap that had frozen into 100 thin blades of red. Bran sat beneath it with a blanket around his shoulders. His eyes were open but did not see her. He looked somewhere farther away. "Pod," Brienne said. "Get him up, now." Podrick crouched and slid his hands beneath Bran's shoulders, rolling him up with the care of a man who has learned that a body hurt is a body that will show you where it is most itself. Another man took his feet. The ring of guards drew in. Brienne turned and saw them coming. They were slow. They were slow as winter deep in a wood, as the way old men walk when their knees ache with a rain that hasn't arrived yet. They were not men. The wight at the front stepped with his feet barely touching the snow. Behind him, the dead moved in the same measure and then, not slowly, suddenly they were running. "Now," Brienne said, and the bowstrings thrummed. Arrows took dead men in eyes and throats. The wight tilted his head, as if in mild curiosity, and the arrows aimed for him struck the air half a hand from his chest and fell for no reason a living man could count. Brienne stepped up to meet him, and Oathkeeper was a red river in her hands. Steel met ice. The ice spear snapped. The wight's torso split like a log under an axe, and he shattered before he fell. The dead behind him fell too, the nearest first, collapsing like badly balanced stones, and the circle around the ring of men moved outward a hand's width. "Move," Brienne said, and they moved backward in step. Bran lifted between them, the bowmen falling back and loosing again, keeping the fire at their feet alive where they could. The godswood was not a place of fire. The godswood was a place of old snow and roots, and here the cold had an easier conversation with what it touched. Brienne stepped between two trunks and met another wight with Oathkeeper. The Valyrian steel cut through him as through frosted glass. He screamed without sound. 3 more fell in cascading ruin. They were not so many, but each one had a web of silent command that made the dead dumb to fall where he fell. Brienne's breath tore at her lungs. She could feel the cold in the place where her shoulder met the collar of her cuirass. She could feel blood begin to run down her side where a wight's rusted knife had found a seam. Podrick stumbled and recovered. "Sorry," he gasped, and Brienne wanted to touch his head to say, "You are. It's enough that you are." She did not turn. "Keep him moving," she said. "To the Sally. Now." Arya met them in the corridor that led down from the godswood. She was bleeding from her ear, a wet red line across the curve of her jaw. She had put the dagger away again. Needle was in her hand. She said, "The inner yard's lost. The dead are through. The crypts are broken. We go out or we go down." Brienne bobbed her head once. "Enough." "Out," she said, and the three of them, 4, counting Podrick, 5, counting the guard with the black beard who had once taught Sansa to sit a saddle, moved toward the side door where the hinges had been oiled yesterday, and yesterday had been a thought of mercy. They made it as far as the turn in the corridor when the cold deepened. This was a colder cold. This was a cold that did not live in the air but in the space where breath had been. The torches guttered, flared, and then shrank to blue veins that could not be touched. The sound of the dead receded as if they had put their hands to their ears to listen to something else. Brienne stopped because stopping was what her body had learned to do when a sword in the other hand was not enough. Arya stopped because movement was a choice and choices had to be seen before they were made. Podrick stopped because he had never learned how not to when Brienne did. The Night King stepped into the corridor. He did not fill it. He did not need to. Behind him, the world's breath seemed to stop to make room for his. His head turned barely at all. His eyes were the particular blue of cold iron that has been sharpened until it will take no more edge. Brienne lifted Oathkeeper. "Oh gods," Podrick breathed, not as a prayer but as a statement of a thing that had been true before he had been born. The Night King took one slow step forward. Bran made a sound like someone who has been awakened from a dream and began to fall to the side. Podrick and the other man steadied him. Arya moved a handbreadth, and then the hand that held the dagger stopped in air. She let needle go. Fell, point ringing on stone. Brienne moved then. She moved as she had always moved, a mixture of grace and stubbornness, her sword a line through the world. She struck for the Night King's chest, and her blade did not break. It passed through the cold as if through water and met something that felt not like flesh or wood or ice but like the place where all three had once sat together and made a deal they had not understood. The shock in her arm ran up to her shoulder. She tasted copper. The Night King turned his head and looked at her as if she were a bird on a branch in winter, briefly curious. He lifted his hand. The air tightened. Brienne felt an invisible fist close on her throat. Spots of brightness gathered at the edges of her vision like snowflakes that had decided to be fire. Arya moved then. She had learned to step from shadow to shadow. She had learned when to breathe and when breath is a thing you keep for later. She reached with her left hand as she had once reached for a cat in the Red Keep, warm and quick, and the dagger came from her sleeve where she had put it 2 turns ago. She went for the hollow at the Night King's collarbone in a movement she had practiced until it was no longer practice. He turned and his hand closed on her wrist. He had expected no knives from boys beneath beds. He had learned many things from the living. He had not learned enough to be surprised. Arya let the dagger fall and had it in the other hand before the air could remember that it had been falling. She drove it for the space under his ribs. This time the dagger did not meet anything. It met air. It passed through a thickness that yielded like a breath taken in by something that had no lungs. Behind him, the wall of ice that had formed on the corridor stones cracked in a pattern like leaves, then knit itself again. He released her hand. Podrick had not moved. That was his gift and his burden. He held Bran up the way he had once held a cup to a knight's mouth on the hottest day he remembered. He looked at the Night King and did not look away. The Night King let his eyes rest on Bran's face. Bran spoke as if the mouth were not his mouth. "You came for a thing we share," he said, and his voice was a dry sound scraped over stone. "You don't know what it is." The Night King made no sound at all. He took another step, and 2 dead men came around the corner behind him, quick as hunger. Brienne moved to engage them. Her lungs fought the air and found none and then found enough. She cut one down and his bones spilled across the floor and tried to remember the shape of a man and couldn't. The second had a piece of steel that might once have been a shovel. It rang off her pauldron and bit into the leather at her shoulder, and she killed him too. "Go," she said, and Arya had Bran's other shoulder now. They moved, slow under the chill, quick under the need. The corridor opened on the sally port. Brienne put her shoulder to the bar, and someone on the other side had already taken the weight from there. The door gave. Night snow came in with the sharp smell of smoke from the inner yard and the salt smell Sansa had sometimes thought she imagined. Men were there, Royce's men, faces black with soot, mouths set to a line they would never speak, and one woman, Sansa. her cloak rimed in frost, her eyes like the river under ice. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be on the wall or in the hall or somewhere not at the hinge of their exit where an arrow could find her by accident while looking for a different name. Sansa looked at Bran's face and put her palm to his cheek as if he were feverish. She looked at Brienne's shoulder where blood ran. She looked at Arya's sleeve dripping red. She looked once, quickly, down the corridor behind them and saw the cold there, as if it were a shape that could be carried in a bucket. "Come," she said. "We go now." They went. Outside the walls the world was a chaos of men and cries and the sound of wood breaking. The dead had found the inner yard. They were trying to find the doors that had been barred against them and would not for long. Sansa's party ran along the wall in the shadow of it, boots slipping once where ice had found a place to be. The gods would loom to their right like a memory they had not yet had time to decide was true. A rope ladder dropped from the top of the inner wall. Tormund Giantsbane came down at hand over hand. His hair and beard hung with ice that looked like jewelry on some horrible king. "Little bird," he said when his boots struck the ground, grinning as if the world being as it was had done him a favor. "We thought you'd stay longer. The dead are polite enough not to break down a door without a proper knocking." He scooped Bran in his arms as if he were nothing but a bundle of sticks and set him upon his own back. "Up," he told him.
"No squealing."
"I don't squeal," Bran said mildly from 1,000 miles away. Beric Dondarrion followed Tormund down with his flaming sword guttering in the wind. The flame looked sullenness itself. He had a fresh slice along his jaw. Blood froze in his beard as he stood there and looked at the corridor. "Hurry, my lady," he said to Sansa. "He is walking the halls now, and he's not a man to be patient." They moved along the wall, fast now, and came to the Hunter's Gate. The great door there stood half open. Snow drifted into its hinge like ash in an old chest. A dozen men had already forced their way through. 2 dead bodies lay in the drift beyond, their faces full of wonder. They were villagers. One had a bailiff's old badge pinned to his chest. He had tried to help. Then, when the dead had found him as if they had remembered his name. From within the yard there came another unearthly roar. The dragons collided in the sky again, clawing at the air, Regal's foreclaws raking along the blue dragon's throat. A burst of blue fire tore wide and struck the solar. Stone collapsed inward with a sound like a mountain deciding to stand again in a different place. From the west wall came the horn. 1 long blast, then 2, then 1 again. The signal was for retreat. It was also for the end of retreat. There was nowhere else to go. They went through the Hunter's Gate and into the Winter Town. Here the houses had been emptied or were in the act of being torn out by their roots. Men dragged sledge runners around corners that had never been meant for such turns. Children with faces raw from cold ran holding hands, stumbling and being pulled. Sansa stopped and turned to the nearest house with a door still upon its hinges and shoved it open. 2 old men looked up from a brazier where a wisp of smoke wandered like a thought. She said, "Out." And they went without asking why, because the voice that tells you when to go had spoken, and you do not ask that voice questions. They reached the South Road. A train of sledges had begun to move east toward the River Road, while another longer line pushed south toward the King's Road and the Neck. Royce had chosen well. Spread them. Split the risk. Sansa had no time to think about whether she was a woman who liked that this had been done. She ran with them. Once she slipped and Brienne's hand closed on her elbow and righted her as a mother would right a toddler who had put a foot wrong on a stair. They had gone a quarter mile when the dead were among the houses behind them. They came like floodwater slipping around every obstruction. The line of sledges shuddered and then moved again. Beric's sword went out like a candle. He grimaced, thumbed it again along the blade, and it flared. "Thuras is not here to do that for you," Tormund grunted. "Don't be a fool and try to die twice." "I've already done that more times than I can count," Beric said ruefully. "But I don't think the Lord of Light keeps a man like me around to count." He fell back to the end of the line where the dead were nearest and stood in a doorway that had no door and burning. A flood of dead men met him, and the fire made of his sword was a name written and rewritten in their faces. and those faces charred and crumbled and still came. Tormund was beside him for one heartbeat, snarling like a bear, his axe cutting a white at the knee and then through the spine when it fell. "Go," he said to Sansa without turning, like a father shouting over his shoulder at a child to get behind him. She went. She had never in her life walked away from a man who was burning himself alive for her until now. She did it as if there had always been such a thing in her life. She did it with her teeth clenched so hard she tasted metal. They ran to the stand of pines at the edge of the winter town, and then down into the shallow dip beyond where the wind cut less keenly. The first line of sledges reached the road and took it, runners squealing on ice-rough ground. The second line cut south. Sansa took the south with Brienne, Arya, Bran on Tormund's broad back, and a dozen of the best men she had. The road led to the King's Road proper and then to the Neck, a place Sansa had heard about since she was small and had imagined as a swamp made only of frogs with crowns on their heads and witches singing in the reeds. Now it was a place of ambush and fire and water that needed them to be brave. Behind them, Winterfell breathed out one long breath of blue fire. The breath lifted into the air and went away. A hall fell. A tower bent and did not stand up again. In the morning that was no morning, just a thinning of the dark, Sansa looked back and saw the first tendril of smoke rising gray into the snow. She did not stop. They pressed south. The King's Road was a white ribbon with raw edges. Men labored to cut a path along it with axes, hacking ice from the edges where it had overgrown. The pines closed in. The wind dropped. The world became muffled in a way that made you think nothing could be chasing you. And then, the third time she had let herself think that they heard the dead in the trees. They did not sound like men. They sounded like something that wanted only to reach a place so much it had stopped needing everything else. There were fewer of them than there had been at the wall by the sound, but fewer was more than enough. "Keep the sledges moving," Sansa said. "Every child rides. Every woman who cannot keep up rides. We fight on the road, not in the trees." The first white broke from the brush like a question. Tormund cut it in the middle and the halves crawled toward his boots. He lifted one on the hook of his axe and flung it into the pine boughs where it hung and thrashed. The rest came at a trot. Brienne set her boots and Oathkeeper flashed red-black. A white came behind the whites and Arya ran and reached him at the same time Brienne did. The two of them moved with a shared knowledge that had nothing to do with love or fondness and everything to do with the particular shape of violence. Arya went low and Brienne went high, and the white shattered between them, and 6 close whites fell as if their strings had been cut. "Good," Tormund grunted. "Break the tall ones, and the little ones fall down." They broke 3 such, and the dead behind them fell silent a space and then found their feet and came on. They were not a single pack. They were 2 scattered clusters of hunger and frost that brushed the road like wolves coming to a scent, and then drew back, and then came again. It was like that all the way to the Neck. They bought every mile with bone and with breath and with the sharpness of Oathkeeper's song. They moved on, Sansa counting, 1 more step, 1 more bend in the road, 1 more smear of blood that had frozen to burgundy and then to black. She found that if she kept her eyes upon the line of Arya's shoulder, she could keep moving. If she thought of anything else, she would stop. If she stopped, all the world behind her would climb over her and go on without her. The Neck was less an arrival than a slow slippage into a different world. The pines thinned. The ground under the snow became uncertain. The King's Road narrowed and then made its own decisions without telling them ahead of time. Willows appeared like haggard women looking for a coin in the snow. Pools of water lay under a skin of ice so thin the sound of stepping near them made the hair on Sansa's arms prick. "Greywater watch," Arya said suddenly. "Father used to tell stories. The crannogmen melt their houses and move them when enemies come. The reeds are thick as hair. If I were made of bones and winter, I would not go here." "Nothing made of bones and winter thinks," Tormund said. "That's not true," Bran said from his sledge, where they had set him once. Tormund had stopped laughing at the idea that he was in fact a horse. "He thinks. He thinks in a way that doesn't have rooms for the things you put in your rooms, but he thinks." Sansa looked down at him. Bran did not look back. He was looking at a thin piece of ice clinging to a reed as if it were the most interesting thing he had ever seen. They were seen long before they saw anyone. A man rose out of the marsh as if the marsh had made him, reeds tied to his shoulders, his hair woven with cattail, a leather cap on his head hung with beads of water. Others came behind him, stepping lightly along causeways Sansa would have sworn were water a break would take you down into forever. They carried short bows with horn tips and bone knives at their belts. The first man inclined his head to Sansa in a courtesy that would have been clumsy anywhere else and was here as graceful as a heron. "Lady of Winterfell," he said, "we have watched for you. My lord was told the storm broke the walls before the riders came." Sansa felt her heart put its fist against her ribs, and then open its hand. "Howland Reed," Bran said on his sledge without raising his voice, and the man's eyes flicked to him and did not show what they felt. "Your father and I once swore an oath in a place where men swore strange oaths," Howland Reed said calmly. "Come, bring fires into the marsh. You cannot see them yet, but there are hands under this water that will try to pull your feet down if you don't step where we step." They stepped where the crannogmen stepped. The causeways seemed to appear as they needed to, a trick of reeds and hidden logs and the knowledge of men who had lived here since before songs knew how to put words to what a reed is. The place the crannogmen brought them to was not a fortress the way a rock is a fortress. It was a tangle of small green islands woven with willow and alder, with causeways like the roots of a tree, with huts of woven reed and thatch that sat on timbers driven into the mud. In the whirlight that was the whole day, you could not say where water ended and land began. It felt like a place that had not decided yet if it wanted to belong to the world. "Women and children first," Howland said. "The sick, you're wounded. Fires here and here and here." He pointed with a hand that did not shake to places Sansa saw as only a scum of green paint on a pond. Men with grapnels came and pulled at the scum, and a platform rose one plank at a time, dripping. "This was Hag's rest once. Now it's yours." He watched her, his gray eyes as quiet as water. "The dead know the road," he said matter-of-factly. "They don't know this. We will make the marsh a piece of fire for them. But they will keep coming. They don't know not to." "Jon is coming," Sansa said. The certainty in her voice surprised her. Howland Reed did not look surprised. "The Queen is with him. The dragons are with him. Then let's make the marsh into a story they can come to." "Stories are good at catching things," Howland said, and the first of the crannogmen stepped away lightly along a causeway that moved under your foot like something sleeping. When night came, the same night, the same unbroken strip of dark, they had 100 small fires burning in places where a man coming from the road would expect water. They had strings of pitch sacks hung on reeds, and holes under the snow that had been filled with brush and dry moss, and traps of sharpened willow hidden under what looked like nothing. They had archers knee-deep in water behind painted hides watching with eyes that did not tire. Sansa walked the nearest of the little islets with Brienne to her left and Arya to her right, and Bran at the center where reeds had been cut away to make a circle of earth and someone had driven 2 stakes into the mud to hold his sledge steady. "It's quiet," Arya said. "It isn't," Brienne said, and that was true. The marsh spoke in small voices, water dripping from leaf to leaf, a fish rolling under the skin of ice, a frog speaking softly because it was too cold for him to be a thing you could hear. Sansa sank down on her heels where Bran could see her face if he wanted to. "Tell me where they are." Bran's eyes focused as if from a long way off. "They are at the ruin where the road drops into the trees," he said. "The ones that can still walk. The white ones talk to one another without words. Some go east to the river. Some go west. They have the dragon still. He circles Winterfell and screams at the snow when the wind wants to push him aside. The other 2, he paused. One is hurt." Sansa's hand closed on Sansa's other hand. She could not tell if she was holding someone else or herself. "Which?" she said, and the word was nothing at all in the air. "I don't know," he said. "Just that one is hurt. There is a patch on a wing where ice clings and the joints there are tired." Brienne put a hand to her own shoulder where the cut had been and made her face give back nothing. They slept, some of them. A boy's sleep with his mouth open. A girl's sleep with her fingers still crooked around an arrow that had been loosed 6 hours before and had not left the hand yet. Sansa did not sleep. Arya slept with her head on her folded arms and her feet under her like a cat. When the dead came into the marsh, they did it as the living do. They tried to be clever and moved slowly and tested the water. One of them, dead once and allured once by the cut of his beard, stepped onto a clump that looked like earth and went through up to his waist. He did not flail. He walked forward, water pulling at his legs in long lagging thoughts, and came to a tangle of willow and found that his bones remembered how to climb. Behind him 10 more came along the causeway the crannogmen had left looking like the road. Howland raised a hand. A boy of no age at all, 10, 12, set a brand to a rope that stretched across the slush to the willow tangle, and the pitch sacks there flared like a line of low suns. The white at the head of the party turned his head as if to hear better, and 3 archers put 3 arrows into him all at once. The horn at its tip cracked. The shaft burst and a snow of frost fell from the leather of his jerkins. He did not fall. He lifted his hand, and what little flame had risen there thinned to blue threads and was gone. The dead stepped over it. "They will make a bridge for themselves," Howland said. "They will fill the places where the water is and then walk across their own dead." "Then we must keep them from making the first bridge," Sansa said. Arya was already moving with a gang of small crannogmen at her heels. They scuttled along a causeway that had not been there a moment ago and was here now, laying brush and pulling it away, setting it on a barge made of bound reeds, and then shoving the barge in with hands that remembered where the depth was less. The dead came on, slower here, still inexorable, still then. Arya's group lit the barge and sent it sliding into the place where the white had turned his head. He turned it again, and the flame died with a long soft sigh. The barge hissed and slid under the ice. "Bring them deeper," Howland murmured. "Bring them here. Let them stand to their thighs so it takes them more time to think. Build them a door and tell them it's open, and then make it not." The marsh became a book the crannogmen had read since they were children. The dead turned page after page and found only more marsh. They fell. They climbed. They used one another to make the world into a thing to be stepped upon. But every time they had nearly contrived a path, a boy with a flaming brand would touch a rope and fire would run in a line across their work and undo it. Arrows took the eyes from their skulls. Once, 3 whites came together and put the water to sleep where it lay, and the peat fires went low and the traps stopped being traps. Brienne and Arya went into the blackness like 2 thoughts made of steel and cut them down. Oathkeeper a bright arc in the fog, the catspaw dagger a small moon. The whites nearest fell to pieces where they stood. In the mud at Brienne's feet a hand kept crawling. She put her heel on it and ground it into the earth until it was only bone powder and weeds. They held the marsh all that night that was not a night. And when the little fires had burned down and the arrows were all spent and the dead had stopped coming because they were finding another place to try, a cry rose from the north, thin from distance but unmistakable. Sansa stood, her heart moving of its own in a way that hurt. A shape came out of the clouds at the edge of the world, and then another. The third came slower. Jon's black cloak streamed like pennons behind him as he bent low along the spine of the dragon. Rhaegal's wings beat a tired line through the air. Drogon dropped with his queen for the little island where Sansa and Howland and the others stood. The spray of snow thrown up by his wings washed over them, and the fire on their little island guttered and went out and then came back like a baby that has decided to keep breathing. The dragon settled in a space that had had no room for him and nonetheless made room. His great eye was a red-brown stone. It regarded Sansa with the calm of something that could eat you without disliking you. Daenerys dismounted with no sound in her boots at all. Her face was white with cold, and not just cold. Frost clung in the ends of her hair, gathered in crystalline little hands. Jon was a breath behind her, dropping to the planks as if the ground might go out from under him, as if he expected it to and was ready to be surprised when it did not. He came to Sansa with snow in his beard and in his eyebrows, and his eyes were the eyes of the boy who had patted Ghost's head for the first time and sworn he would keep something that had never asked to be kept. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words went to water on his tongue. "You're here," Sansa said. "We have a swamp that wants to keep us. It seems to like men with wet boots." He pulled her into an embrace that cramped the muscles in her back and made them let go. For a heartbeat, she let her forehead drop to his shoulder, as if she were a child who had been running too long. Then she stepped back because she remembered that she was the woman people looked at when they wanted a reason. Daenerys stood a pace away, and the space between them was a thing Sansa did not know what to call. She did not reach for a word. There was no time. "We tried to find you in time," Daenerys said. "The wind kept driving us backward. He came too fast." She looked toward the north without blinking, as if by not blinking she could hold the sky still. "I tried to burn him. He doesn't burn." Sansa held her eyes. "So we learned. We can't fight him in the sky alone," Jon said. "We can push him off you. We can't kill him. We need something else." Bran's voice from the sledge came like the echo of someone speaking down a well. "You can't kill him because the place where he dies isn't here." Silence. Even the marsh seemed to pause. Daenerys turned. "What does that mean?" Bran looked at Sansa and at Jon and finally at Arya, who stood at his shoulder with a strip of cloth she had torn from her sleeve to tie around her ear where it had been bleeding. "He is bound to a place where men made an oath with trees," he said. "They made him there. If he dies in the wrong place, the death won't hold. It's why the children of the forest cut the first man on the breast with obsidian at a weirwood. It's why he broke when he broke the first time. The place matters." "The Isle of Faces," Howland said softly. "You speak of the Green Men's Isle." Bran nodded. "There the old gods will remember what he is. They will remember it in the right way. Here the snow remembers too much and too little." "When were you going to tell us this?" Arya asked, and there was no heat in it. There was only the question you ask of a brother who has brought you another question when all you had wanted was an answer. "I wanted you safe first," Bran said. "I did not succeed, but I can try another way." "How far is it?" Jon asked. "From here to the God's Eye." Daenerys's breath smoked as she spoke. "Far. Farther than any of us has. It's a river and then a lake and then a place men don't go. You would have us lead him there? How?" "The dead follow what he follows," Bran said. "If he looks at me, they look at me. He is looking at me now." Sansa felt the words as if they had weight. "Then we must not let him look at you," she said, "until we choose the place." Jon turned his head toward the north. Somewhere beyond the thick of the pines a sound rose, the distant guttural tearing cry of a dragon that has been taught to hate. "We can't take all these people to the God's Eye," he said. "We get them to White Harbor. We send them south. We hold him here while we can. Then we run. And we hope that he wants you more than he wants a city of 1,000,000 souls." "He does," Bran said peacefully. Daenerys's head came up. "Good. Then we feed him the neck. We give him lungful after lungful of water and fire. We cut his generals when they come to freeze our work. We keep him long enough for Rhaegal to mend and Drogon to keep flying. We ferry people to White Harbor and to ships. We make White Harbor bleed for us, and we write letters to the Knights of the Vale and to the Riverlands, and we promise them a world to live in if they help us live long enough to find the right place to kill him." Sansa's mouth tightened, but her head moved in a motion that was not quite a nod, not quite a bow. "Manderly will do what he has always done when the North is bleeding," she said. "He will take a towel and put it to the wound, and you will owe him another song. He likes songs." "I have no songs," Daenerys said. "I only have fire and the wish to use it well." "Then we will see which the marsh likes best," Howland said. They set their work in order. Jon and Daenerys flew again that night, Drogon and Rhaegal sweeping the sky over the marsh in great brown and green circles. The dead tried to come in at 5 places and were driven back in 4, and at the 5th they came too fast and too heavy with a wight at their head who had a crown of frost like antlers, and the long line of causeway stones there was taken and men died, and the dead used their bodies to make the road longer. Tormund pulled 2 boys out of the water and set them kicking on a plank until they coughed up marsh and cried. Beric held a narrow bridge while Sansa and 6 others hauled a sledge full of children from one island to the other. He set the bridge alight as he stepped off, and the wight behind him stepped into fire and went through it because it was too late to be clever. He did not come back at dawn. What passed for dawn? Tormund came to Sansa with his braid burned halfway and his laughter gone and said, "He gave the fire to them and had none left for himself." Sansa stood very still. She had become good at that. "I hope his god knows his name," she said. "We do." She wrote to White Harbor with numb fingers and watched the dragons stagger a little less in the sky each time they took wing. Arya ate and slept where she could and slipped in the reeds like something the marsh had decided to keep. Brienne's wound began to itch and then to ache in the dull way that says this flesh is learning to be itself again. She did not remove her armor to sleep because she could not. Howland Reed moved among them like a man who did not know what it was to be surprised by his own hands. He never raised his voice, and yet men moved when he spoke to them as if he had shouted in their ears. Wolken coughed and made lists with a stubborn small will that would have looked silly anywhere but here and turned into a kind of bravery. At White Harbor, Wyman Manderley sent sledges with salt fish and loaves of heavy barley bread and a barrel of pickled onions that made men gasp when they first bit into them and then whisper alliances with whatever god had made onions. He sent men to cut a passage along the river and to put children on boats. He sent a letter that said, in ink that had run once and then dried again, that the wolf's den would take the very youngest and the sick, that his men would hold the outer streets until their feet fell off, that the old and the poor had already taken to praying and he did not intend to stop them because it was cheaper than wine. Sansa smiled when she read that and then did not smile because smiling was a thing that got in the way of other things. On the fourth day, the sky over Winterfell glowed in a low, constant way, like embers under ash. That night, the blue dragon turned his head toward the south, and the dead pressed into the marsh from the north, east and west all at once. They came across places where the water was so deep a living man would have drowned with his first step. They did not drown. They walked along the bottom and came up like things the marsh had decided it wanted to give back out of spite. "Now," Howland said, and the marsh itself seemed to answer. Fire moved along the water. It did not sit upon it like oil. It slid along the veins of peat under the ice where the crannogmen had taught it to be. It came up in 100 places in 100 small yellow hands that grasped at the dead and pulled. The dead burned. They burned slowly. They burned in a way that made you think they had never been anything else but fuel. The whites at their backs lifted their hands and the flames dimmed. But there were too many hands and the water hissed and steamed. The air filled with mist. The marsh sang a low song. A white stepped onto the little island where the stakes held Bran's sledge. He had a spear like a spine ripped from some giant fish. Brienne met him, and Oathkeeper made a line in the air too fast to see. He fell. Another came and Arya took him at the back of the knee, came up under the ribs and twisted, and he did not fall because he had already been falling for 1,000 years. The third came smoking, steam hissing from his joints, and he reached for Bran with his left hand. Sansa drove a spear through his wrist. It was not a good spear. It was a marsh spear, heavy at the point with fishbone, wrapped in leather that had been a belt. It did not stop him. It slowed him enough for Brienne to cut his head clean through. He shattered. The 4 nearest dead went down like sacks of grain dropped off a cart. Sansa stepped back, spear but in mud. Her hands were shaking. She did not let go. The dead came all that night that was not a night and were held. At dawn the dragons lifted again and went north to harry the rear of that endless line that made its way down the road that had once been the King's Road and was now just a line in the snow. Jon returned with 24 children clinging to the back of Regal like mollusks clinging to a stone in tide. Their fingers had to be uncurled one by one. One of them smiled at Sansa with lips blue as river ice and said, "You are the lady," as if he had been expecting a different word. "We can't hold this forever," Jon said to Sansa in the gap between flying and eating and sleeping and the next flying. "We're using them up. They are using us up. He jerked his chin toward the north. "He gets more when we lose one. I need to know if we can move soon. To the lake. And leave this," Sansa said. "Leave them." He looked at her and did not look away. "We will leave them to Manderley," she said finally. It was like choosing which finger to put a ring on when the ring is hot. "We will leave them to the boats and to their own will. We will leave them because if we do not, nothing will be left anywhere." Daenerys came then with her hair unbound and a coil of frost at her hairline that made her look briefly like a woman with a thin silver crown. "He is learning," she said. "He doesn't attack where the fire is thickest anymore. He goes around and pulls the water over the fire like a blanket. His generals go for the men who light the ropes. They know what a rope is now. They learn what they need to know, Arya said dryly. Then we learn faster, Daenerys said, and there was no pride in it. There was only the exhaustion of someone who has decided that tired is a condition that belongs to a different life. They sent their first letter to the Riverlands that afternoon. Sansa wrote it. Howland dictated the names of men she had never met but who had once sworn things in a hall she had known only from father's stories. She wrote to Edmure Tully at Riverrun, to the Blackwoods and the Brackens both, and told them to hold the hands of their old oaths and make a cup with them for the river. She wrote to the Seaguard Lord. She wrote to every petty banner house that might yet have a hall and a field to muster in. She wrote to the Brotherhood without banners, though she knew that its banner had been burnt on a cold hillside to the last thread. She wrote to Catelyn Tully's sister's house, too, because even dead women had rooms in the rivers where their names meant something. By the time the ravens had flown salt-cold and heavy-winged into that sky, the dead had pressed the marsh to a thinness. The little islands were smaller. The pathways were more narrow. The fires took longer to want to be fire. Even Howland's face grew lines that had not been there yesterday. Now, Bran said that evening, without preamble, without looking. He was looking somewhere else. He has set his eyes upon another place. Someone moved a piece he knows. We can go while he is looking away, and he will follow. Sansa stood very still. Where? South, Bran said. Much south. He is looking toward the lake where the sky is inside the water. The God's Eye, Howland said. He looks to it. Bran nodded. We must make him need to bring his eyes there the rest of the way. Then we are done here, Daenerys said. She turned to Sansa. We gather what we can. We go by the White Knife to White Harbor. The rest go south along the King's Road with the Crannogmen walking either side of them like ghosts with fish knives. And we pray there are no men's armies to waylay them, because if there are, we will not stop for them. We have no quarrel now that is not with the dead. And if Cersei sees us and thinks she wants to be the queen of a graveyard, Sansa said, then let her have her crown. It will fit better then. Jon said, Sansa, as if he wanted to take those words away from the air and hide them in his hands. She lifted her chin. He had made choices. She had made hers. There was no room for anything else between a dragon's wingbeat and a marsh fire. They began to move at first light of what could only be called a habit. The youngest and the oldest and the most broken took boats. White Harbor took them in with its filthy, beautiful arms and fed them pickled onions until they cried. The rest trudged. The Crannogmen walked the edge of the world and made it hold. They put their little fires where the dead liked to step. The last of their reed platforms came apart behind them and slid back into the water, and the marsh smoothed itself as if nothing had ever been where it had just been. Sansa stood on the last little island with Brienne and Arya and Howland Reed and watched the marsh become what it wanted to be when no one watched it. Bran slept. Tormund stood with his hands hanging loose at his sides, flexing once, twice, the way a man flexes before he picks up a weight he cannot gauge by looking at it. Drogon circled low overhead. The beat of his wings raked across Sansa's scalp, and the hair there felt as if it had been moved a hand's breadth and would never find the same place again. Do you regret staying to the last? Arya asked Howland Reed as if she were asking him if he regretted a loaf of bread that had burnt on the bottom. He smiled with half his mouth. A marsh has no last, only another first. Men like to make stories where the last is very fierce and has a big sound. But a marsh likes to think in the other way. Thinks, where shall I put this bit of water next? It doesn't mind being patient. We are not marsh, Sansa said, and the wind cut the white smoke of her breath into the June of someone else's life. We have a place to be, and soon. Howland Reed nodded. Then go, and never say that the neck had nothing but frogs. She did not. Later she would say that the neck had frogs and knives and men who could put a fire in the water and decide where it came up. Later she would say it had a house that moved and a lord who did not think that meant anything special except that it made the housekeeping more complicated. Later she would say it had given them another breath. They took that breath and moved. The river road was wide where the wind had scoured it bare and narrow where drifts lay. Jon flew ahead and circled back and made his body that had learned the sky be a sign for men on the ground. Daenerys flew in wider circles, looking for the blue dragon's shape on the horizon. He had been left above Winterfell, circling, gnawing at the walls with his fire as if to make a nest in the slag. Now he moved south, the Night King's cold thought pushing him like a hand between the shoulder blades. In White Harbor, Sansa found Manderley in his hall with maps spread under iron candlesticks and men coming and going like an armada of small tides. He was fat as ever, his cheeks red with the rage of work and winter both. He put a hand like a ham upon the map when Sansa came and said, "My lady, you come with a house on your back, and you expect me to let every room in mine. Of course I will." "I know," Sansa said, and he grunted, satisfied by the fact that she had not wasted both their time pretending to ask. He had already sent hundreds aboard cogs and carracks and even fishing smacks with patched sails that would have been laughed from the river in summer. Now they were all ships, and he sent them out into a sea that bucked and considered doing worse. Jon stood on the basin wall watching one such vessel put off with 50 children on its deck and Davos Seaworth at the helm. He had appeared like a seal, from nowhere, from a fog bank, from a story, swearing and blessing the bolts and his own weathered hands in equal measure. "I never wanted to be anyone's lord," Davos told Sansa and bowed anyway. "But I'd be the lord of good luck if I could. The lads and lasses all call me that, so I suppose that's a start." "Are you any good at it?" Sansa asked. "No," he said frankly, "but I'm very stubborn." She found she could smile at that, small and crooked, and that it made something in her ribs stop aching for 3 breaths. Then she stopped smiling because it was their way now to fetch what hope they could and then put it down. They did not stay. That had always been the shape. They ate hot food standing in the hall. They let the steam of it clean their throats for an hour. Daenerys went to her dragons and lay along Drogon's neck as if she had been made to fit there. Jon went to Bran and sat beside him and watched him breathe and said nothing, as if this had become the best prayer he knew. Before they left, Sansa climbed the steps of the Wolf's Den and looked down upon the river. It was full of small boats. Men hauled at the ropes. Children waved and did not know why they were waving. The old castle looked back at her with all its broken teeth and said nothing. She could hear the sea outside the haven grinding stones. She turned and went back down and made herself pick up a bread trencher and tear it in two and hand the half to a child with eyes like the sea in summer, because there had to be a summer again even if she could not remember it. The child took it and bowed as if she had been taught court again for the first time in her life. It made Sansa think of Septa Mordain for a heartbeat, and then she did not. They left White Harbor under a sky that had decided to be pale instead of white and made for the south with the river to their left like a long molded blade. There was a moment on the road where Sansa looked back and realized she had not sent a letter to someone whose name she had once been made to practice writing, because there was no one left who needed one, and she felt a fissure open in her chest. She closed it with her breath. They passed fields given up to snow. They passed cottages with their doors open and no smoke at their chins. They passed a man who had hung himself from a beam in his shed rather than imagine another day without his wife's hands, and the shed had not fallen and the rope had not broken, and Sansa did not look away because she would not look away anymore. Tormund cut the man down without ceremony and kicked the rope into a drift and said, gruffly, to the empty air, "You're late for the fighting." And they went on. At the border between the north and the Riverlands, the snow changed its mind and became sleet. Men cursed at it in 2 accents. The towers of Moat Cailin had no words for the version of war that had just walked through them. They were already dead stones and did not know how to be killed again. Still, Sansa found herself lay a hand on the wet wall as they went by and say thank you under her breath. To the stones, to the marsh, to the bones under the water, to the frogs who had watched with their pop eyes. In the Riverlands, the world began to have edges again. Trees had bark that you could see. The air had wet in it that came from something other than snow ground to dust. They saw men among trees who had the look of bandits, and then of men who had decided a banner was a thing you could carry in your pocket and pull out when it became useful, and Sansa's guards glared and showed steel, and those men decided banners were not so interesting after all. Riverrun's banners did not show at the ford. Edmure Tully's letter had said he was under close watch by men loyal to the Golden Company. When Sansa read it, there had been a small dry laugh at the edge of it, as if he had learned that words could curve and wanted her to know that his voice could do it too, after all. They cut across fields instead and saw lights in a village at night and did not go to them because men had put the lights there and not gods. They came to a crossroads and the wind there smelled like a memory of summer rain. The blue dragon came 2 mornings later, his cry like rust tearing from a blade. He had found them. The dead had found them. The wind went cold in the space between one breath and the next, and their breath made clouds again that hung in the air too long. Women pressed children against their hips and men lifted spears like they were trying to hold the sky in place with sticks. "Fly," Sansa said to Jon and Daenerys, and they did, their dragons rising like 2 old oaks deciding to move for once. The sky filled with them and the blue dragon's flame split the air. Drogon's fire answered it. The 2 flames hissed and turned to white steam that made a cloud with a belly like a pregnant thing, and the world under it was briefly soft and suffocating. "Regal," Jon called, and whether he spoke to the dragon or to the air hardly mattered. The green dragon rose and fell and rose again, and then turned toward the east as if he'd seen a thing the others had not. "The lake," Bran murmured. "There." They ran again. They ran because that is what the living do when the dead are coming for them. They ran with the river singing on their left and the road grumbling under their boots and the sky grinding its teeth. Men died in the ditches and on the road, and they picked them up and put them on sledges or set them to the side and said, "I will come back for you." And sometimes they did and sometimes they did not. They slept 2 hours when there were 2 hours they could trust. They ate bread that was like biting a piece of wall and meat that had been jerked in summer and tasted like a promise that had become a joke and still would feed you. And then there it was. The gods I spread out under a sky made of iron. Even in winter it did not freeze all the way, and where it did freeze the ice was gray, a living slate. At its center lay the Isle of Faces, dark with oak and ash and elm, with pale spears of weirwood rising among them like the bones of something old buried shallow. A mist lay upon the lake the way a woman lays a veil upon her hair for a long walk. The reed beds at the edge whispered and were still. There were no boats until the green men came. They stepped out from the reeds with faces painted green and brown and white. Their hair was woven with leaves and the leaves had not fallen off. Their eyes were the silver gray of dawn. They did not speak. They simply pushed boats out with poles and held them steady and looked at Sansa with no surprise at all, as if she had been expected. "Howland Reed," Sansa said. "Did you send word to them?" "I told a place that has ears," he said. "Some places do." They loaded the first boats with the children and the last with the steel. Sansa went in the second to last, not because she wanted to leave late, but because she wanted to make sure those who had to leave did not think there was a time when you could say no to a god. Brienne stepped into the same boat and it dipped under her and then held. Arya stepped into one of her own and it did not move at all. A green man had braced it with his shin and looked at her as if she had been a bird that had decided not to fly, and he found that pleasing. The water lay flat until the blue dragon screamed. Then it breathed. The green men bent their backs and the boats slid and the mist took them and made the nearer things far and the farther things near. The dead came down to the water's edge. They hesitated, not because they knew hesitation but because the water did not want them and told their feet so. The whites at their head lifted their hands and the water changed its mind in small places. On the island the trees listened. Sansa could feel them listening. The heart trees bled thin frozen tears of sap down their faces. The ravens came in and perched in their hundreds with their heads cocked. Bran's sledge was lifted and carried among roots. There was a place in the center of the isle where the ground had been polished by knees. Bran was set there. Jon came striding up with his sword at his side, and his hair like a man who has run a long way through a house where everything is burning. Daenerys stood with her hand on Drogon's shoulder, and the dragon's head turned toward the north, nostrils flaring. Regal lay in the shallows, chest heaving, wings set wide. His good eye watched the sky. "Now," Bran said to no one, to everyone, to the trees. "He is here." The Night King stepped onto the water. He did not sink. He did not walk upon it like a man. The water learned how to be a floor under him. He came with the blue dragon circling above and dead men finding their way across the reeds upon one another's backs. The whites took their places in a half-ring at the shore. The air grew still in the way an animal's heart grows still when its throat is being stroked. The ravens made a sound like knives on a bone. Bran lifted his eyes and the world seemed to lift on their axis with it. Sansa stood at the edge of the kneeling place with a spear in her hand and could feel the tree at her back like the back of a man in a crowded church. Arya stood a pace in front of Bran with the dagger in her right hand and needle at her back. Brienne stood to Bran's left with Oathkeeper in both hands. Her feet set for a blow that would come or not come and was none of her business. Jon stood to Bran's right with his sword in his hand and Ghost at his knee, the direwolf's fur bristling along his spine like grass in a sudden wind. Daenerys stood a stone's throw behind them with Drogon's head lowered and regal, hurting, with his wings like sails slack at a dock. The Night King put his foot on the island. It was like a bell being struck. It rang up through the roots and the trunks and the leaves and into the sky. The dragon above flinched at it. Men clapped their hands to their ears. The cold came forward and stopped because it had found a thing that was not like the others. Puzzled it. It could not eat it the way it ate fire or breath or hope. It went around it and found more of it, and then the cold began to think. He took another step. Bran's eyes were full of the same cold, and they were not. He looked at the Night King, and for the first time Sansa thought she saw in that blue not an absence but a fullness that had been there so long it had stopped needing to defend itself. Bran spoke. "You were a man," he said. "You wanted your world to stop changing because the very thing you loved had been cut down or drowned or chopped for firewood. You wanted the way the shadows fall in winter to be the way they always fell. You were tired of watching your children die for the songs of new gods. You asked the old ones to stop the river. They stopped it for you, and then you had a river of ice." The Night King made no sign. He was a shape under winter. He was one possible answer to the question. What do we do with grief when it is more than one man's? "You can stop now," Bran said. The Night King lifted his hand. The white at his right raised a spear. Arya moved and the white stopped being a thing with joints. He fell as if he had never learned the trick of standing. Cold slid into the space he had left and found it already taken. Brienne stepped forward and the second white broke under her blade. Jon plunged Longclaw into the third and he shattered with a sound like hail. The Night King lifted his hand again and the dead on the far shore stopped and turned their faces toward the island as if a smell had reached them. He stepped into the kneeling place and his shadow stepped through Sansa and Brienne and Arya and Jon and bent across Bran to the roots of the tree. Sansa felt it in her gut and in her teeth. She put one hand back and touched the bark of the heart tree, and it felt alive and old and indifferent, and in that indifference she felt a kind of mercy. "Now, Arya," Jon said, and Arya moved. She moved like a thing that had always known how to move and had only been pretending to be a girl. She leapt not for the Night King's throat, because she remembered the corridor and how his hand had closed on hers when she had tried that. She went for his wrist this time, the hand he had held out to stop the world, and the dagger met it. He caught her. He did not look down. He looked at Bran. Bran took a breath. It made no sound at all, and every tree on the island breathed with him. Sansa felt the weight in her hand change. The spear grew lighter, as if the wood had been drinking. The sap running in the heart tree quickened. The red on its face deepened. The air above the kneeling place cooled, but not in the way the Night King cooled it. It cooled like a hand going down upon a fevered brow. The old gods were not gods, not the way Southerners meant. But they remembered. Arya let the dagger fall again, as she had in the corridor. It dropped and Bran's hand moved, and in the air between falling and fallen, the catspaw dagger touched the heart tree's bark. Sap smeared it, thin and bright and red as summer. The blade took that red into itself. It did not drink it. It inhabited it. The steel turned a color that had no name in man's tongue for a heartbeat. The dagger fell into Arya's other hand. She drove it into the place below the Night King's breastbone, as she had driven it into men in alleys and princes in halls. The blade met him as if he were water, and then it met what the old gods remembered and would not forget, and it did not pass through. He looked down. He did not look surprised. He did not know how to feel surprise. He knew how to feel the end of a long thing. Finally, the dagger slid up into him. A sound began in him, a thin sound like wind through a wet reed. The blue in his eyes brightened, then dimmed. He reached to take Arya's throat and found nothing to take. She had stepped back. Jon stepped forward and with Longclaw took the head off the white that had taken a step toward Bran. Brienne took another. The air changed. The ravens screamed and lifted and went up as one. The Night King took one more breath he did not need. He broke. He broke in a way that was not falling apart. He broke like a pattern in frost disappearing when a hand is laid upon the window. He broke like a thought forgotten, like a story men had told to keep themselves brave and now did not need to tell. He did not shatter into ice. He unmade. The blue dragon above gave one last howl that made the lake move and then fell in a great tear of air, his wings jerking and then relaxing. He came down on the far shore where the dead had stood and his body slid a long way, pushing reeds and earth in a wave that left the roots of willow exposed and the bones of men who had been buried where no one had thought to find them again. He lay still and the blue turned to the white of something that had never known color. Regal lifted his head and cried a dry, tired cry that might have been grief. On the shore the dead fell. They fell like winter does when a thaw takes the last of it. They fell into piles that steamed and then cooled. Some of the whites staggered and stepped forward as if they had their own will at last and then collapsed into what they had been made of. The wind blew. It did not carry cold the same way. Sansa stood with the spear point resting in the mud and her hand on the heart tree and went on breathing because that was the thing she had taught her body to do. Arya took the dagger out of the mud where she had dropped it without realizing she had dropped it and wiped it on a handful of reed leaves with the care of someone who has learned that a blade is a living thing and thanked it, though not out loud because that would have been silly. Brienne let the tip of Oathkeeper rest. The muscles in her shoulders trembled. She made them stop. Jon reached to Bran and put his hand on his shoulder and felt him warm. Daenerys sank to her knees on the litter of dead leaves and put her forehead to Drogon's muzzle and closed her eyes as if that would help the world keep its shape. Regal lowered his battered head and blew a warm, long breath over them all. It smelled like wet cinder and iron. The green men came out from among the trees without speaking and began to lead the boats back to the reeds. They did not look at the place where the Night King had unmade. They looked as if this was a thing they had seen once, in a story, and wanted to be respectful to the story without treating it like a god. Sansa looked at the faces of the heart trees. They did not change. Men would change now. That was enough. They went back across the lake in boats weighted differently. They walked up the bank and onto a road that had been roads in the mouths of men for 1,000 years. The sky had not learned how to be blue again, but it made a try. On the hill beyond the reeds a stag stepped out from behind a bush and looked down at them. It snorted. It turned and trotted away, leaving prints that filled with water and then with sun as if it had been a light rain. On the third day after the island, the sun forced a shadow. It was thin and oblique and it ran along the edge of a stone like a line of ink. A woman in the line put her hand to her mouth and cried once softly as if she had been bitten, because she had forgotten what a shadow was. Jon walked with Sansa and Daenerys among the men and women who were not dead. He said, "We will take back Winterfell. We will rebuild Winterfell," Sansa said. "Taking it back is not a thing. Building it is. We will lift the walls stone by stone. We will put the godswood back where it belongs, even if the trees we put there pretend not to know us. We will make the kitchens sing and the forges hiss and the men complain about the porridge being too thin. We will teach children to call the names of our dead. That is taking it back." Daenerys glanced at her sidelong and did not speak because there had already been too many words. She looked instead at the road ahead and at the sky where Regal flew a little easier and Drogon steady. She thought, not "I did this" or "I will do this," but simply, "This must be done." Some of the sharpness around her mouth softened for the length of a breath. Arya came up with mud to her knees and said to Jon, "When you get your king's head settled back on your shoulders, you'll still be my brother." "I know," Jon said, as if it were the simplest of all the truths they had been forced to hold. "And you'll still be the one I'm most afraid of." Arya laughed then, quick and hard. because the world had given them back a place where a laugh could live for a moment, and she did not intend to waste it. At the turn of the road that looked west toward the river, they passed under an oak that had held its leaves longer than it should have. The leaves were brown and rattled like paper. A wind came. It moved the leaves. It moved the hair at Sansa's temple. It moved hardly anything else. The dead were dead. Winter remained, and the road went on.